How was London in 1500? A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1: The Physical City. Walls, Streets, and the Thames. The Medieval Fortress City. In the year 1500, London was a medieval walled city of approximately 50,000 to 75,000 souls, a remarkable concentration of humanity for its time. England's capital stood on the north bank of the River Thames, its ancient Roman walls still largely intact, enclosing a densely packed urban world that would seem utterly foreign to modern eyes. This was Tudor London, just 15 years into the reign of the new Tudor dynasty, a city poised between the medieval past and the Renaissance future. The city walls, originally built by the Romans over 1,000 years earlier and repaired countless times since, defined London's boundaries and character. These massive stone fortifications stretched approximately 3 miles around the city, punctuated by gates that controlled access, and were locked each night at curfew. The walls rose 20 feet high in places, topped with walkways where watchmen patrolled, ever vigilant for threats from without. 7 principal gates pierced these walls, each with its own character and purpose. Aldgate in the east opened toward the road to Colchester and the eastern counties. Bishopsgate led north toward Cambridge and the wool-producing regions. Moorgate, a relatively recent addition, opened onto the marshy moorlands beyond. Cripplegate, Aldersgate, and Newgate provided access to the north and west. Ludgate, the westernmost gate, opened toward Westminster, where the royal court and parliament sat. Each gate was a fortress in miniature, with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, portcullises that could be dropped in emergencies, and rooms above where gatekeepers lived. At night, when the gates closed, London became a sealed world. Those caught outside after curfew would find no entry until morning, forced to seek shelter in the suburbs that sprawled beyond the walls. The River Thames. The River Thames was London's greatest asset and its defining feature. This broad tidal waterway connected the city to the sea, and thus to the trade routes that stretched to every known corner of the world. The Thames was London's highway, its sewer, its source of water, and the foundation of its wealth. The river teemed with vessels of every description, great merchant ships anchored in the Pool of London below the bridge, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope. Smaller craft darted between them, wherries carrying passengers, lighters transporting cargo, fishing boats seeking the day's catch. The cry of boatmen offering passage echoed across the water from dawn to dusk. London Bridge was the only crossing of the Thames for many miles, and it was one of the wonders of England. This massive stone structure, completed in 1209, stretched over 900 feet across the river, supported by 19 arches. But London Bridge was far more than a mere crossing. It was a street, a neighborhood, a commercial district suspended above the rushing water. Buildings lined both sides of the bridge, rising 4 and 5 stories high, their upper floors jutting out over the roadway until they nearly touched, creating a dark tunnel even at midday. Shops occupied the ground floors. Haberdashers, glovers, pin makers, and dozens of other trades. Residents lived above, and a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Becket stood at the center of the bridge. The bridge's construction created a dangerous obstacle in the river. Water rushed through the narrow arches with tremendous force, especially at tide changes. Shooting the bridge in a small boat was genuinely dangerous, and many chose to disembark above the bridge and re-embark below, rather than risk the passage. The watermen who navigated these currents were skilled and brave, earning their fares through genuine expertise. Streets and buildings. Within the walls, London's streets followed patterns established centuries earlier, winding organically through the urban fabric with little regard for geometry or planning. Main thoroughfares like Cheapside and Watling Street were wide enough for carts to pass, but most streets were narrow lanes where pedestrians dominated and wheeled traffic squeezed through with difficulty. The streets were unpaved for the most part, surfaces of packed earth that turned to mud in wet weather and choked with dust when dry. Open channels called kennels ran down the center of many streets, carrying rainwater, household waste, and less mentionable substances toward the river. The smell of a medieval city was powerful and pervasive, a mixture of animal dung, human waste, rotting refuse, and the smoke of countless fires. Buildings crowded together, their upper stories projecting outward over the streets. In a practice called jettying, this maximized floor space on upper levels while creating dark, narrow canyons below. Buildings of 3, 4, even 5 stories were common, their timber frames filled with wattle and daub or brick. Thatch remained the most common roofing material, despite periodic attempts to mandate tile or slate for fire safety. Fire was the ever-present terror of medieval London. The city had burned repeatedly throughout its history, and would burn again catastrophically in 1666. Buildings were packed so tightly that flames could leap from roof to roof with terrible speed. Fire hooks stood ready at major intersections, tools for pulling down burning buildings to create fire breaks. Churches and landmarks. London in 1500 was a city of churches. Over 100 parish churches served the spiritual needs of the population, their towers and steeples punctuating the skyline. The sound of church bells marked the hours, called the faithful to worship, announced deaths and celebrations, and warned of emergencies. The bells of London created a constant soundscape that modern visitors would find overwhelming. Old St. Paul's Cathedral dominated the city, its massive Gothic bulk rising on Ludgate Hill. This was not the Renaissance masterpiece that Christopher Wren would later build, but a medieval cathedral of immense size and antiquity. Its spire, the tallest in England before being struck by lightning in 1561, rose over 450 feet above the city. St. Paul's was not only a place of worship, but a center of commerce, gossip, and social life, its nave serving as a shortcut and meeting place. The Tower of London stood at the city's eastern corner, where the walls met the river. This formidable fortress served multiple purposes: royal residence, treasury, armory, mint, and prison. The White Tower at its heart, built by William the Conqueror, remained the most imposing structure in the city. The tower's reputation for dark deeds was already well established, though the most famous Tudor tragedies lay in the future. Westminster, a mile upstream from the city, was technically a separate jurisdiction. Here stood Westminster Abbey, the great church where English monarchs were crowned and buried. The Palace of Westminster housed Parliament, and much of the royal administration. The road from the city to Westminster, called the Strand, was lined with the mansions of nobles and bishops, their gardens stretching down to the river. Beyond the walls. The suburbs beyond London's walls were growing rapidly despite periodic attempts to restrict them. To the east, the parishes of Whitechapel, Stepney, and Wapping housed workers and maritime trades. To the north, Shoreditch and Clerkenwell were developing. To the west, the Strand connected the city to Westminster through a ribbon of development. Southwark, across the river at the southern end of London Bridge, was technically in Surrey, and thus beyond the city's jurisdiction. This made it attractive for activities the city authorities frowned upon. The area was known for its taverns, brothels, the stews, and bear-baiting arenas. The bishops of Winchester owned much of Southwark, and the prostitutes who worked there were ironically known as Winchester geese. The countryside pressed close to London's suburbs. Within a short walk of the walls, one could reach open fields, farms, and villages. Market gardens supplied the city with vegetables. Cattle and sheep were driven through the streets to markets within the walls. The boundary between urban and rural was porous and constantly shifting. Chapter 2: The People. Population, classes, and social structure. A city of 50,000. London in 1500 held between 50,000 and 75,000 inhabitants, making it by far the largest city in England, though small by European standards. Paris, the largest city in Western Europe, held perhaps 200,000 people. London was growing, however, and would continue to grow explosively over the coming century, driven by immigration from the English countryside. The population was young by modern standards. Life expectancy at birth was perhaps 35 years, though those who survived childhood might live considerably longer. Infant mortality was horrifying. Perhaps 1 child in 3 died before their 5th birthday. Plague, smallpox, typhus, and countless other diseases carried off children and adults alike with grim regularity. London was a city that consumed its population. Deaths exceeded births in most years, and only constant immigration maintained and grew the population. Young people from every county in England came seeking opportunity, training, or simply survival. Some prospered, many died, most simply endured, adding their labor to the urban economy. The population was surprisingly diverse for its time. While overwhelmingly English, London included communities of foreign merchants, Italians from Venice, Florence, and Genoa, Germans from the Hanseatic League, Flemish weavers and craftsmen, French traders. These foreigners clustered in particular neighborhoods, maintaining their own customs while participating in London's commercial life. The nobility and gentry. At the apex of London's social hierarchy stood the nobility, the hereditary peers who held titles and great estates. Dukes, earls, barons, and their families maintained London houses for attending Parliament, conducting business at court, and participating in the social season. Their mansions, particularly along the Strand, were substantial complexes with gardens, stables, and accommodation for large households of servants. The gentry, wealthy landowners without noble titles, formed a larger class below the nobility. Knights, esquires, and gentlemen came to London for law terms when the courts sat at Westminster, and for other business. Many maintained London lodgings, or stayed in inns during their visits. Their presence swelled the city's population during certain seasons. These upper ranks wielded enormous power. They controlled Parliament, advised the monarch, and administered justice in their home counties. Their patronage determined careers, and their displeasure could mean ruin. The elaborate deference that Tudor society demanded of lower ranks toward higher was constantly displayed in London's streets and public spaces. Merchants and professionals. The great merchants of London formed a wealthy and powerful class. The merchant adventurers traded cloth to the Low Countries. The staplers dealt in wool, importers brought wine from Gascony, silk from Italy, spices from the distant east. Successful merchants might accumulate fortunes rivaling those of minor nobility, and some purchased country estates to establish their descendants as gentry. The livery companies, descendants of the medieval guilds, organized and controlled trade in specific commodities or crafts. The mercers, grocers, drapers, goldsmiths, and other great companies wielded enormous influence, controlling entry to their trades, regulating quality, and providing mutual support to their members. The leaders of these companies, the aldermen who governed the city, were among the most powerful men in England. Professionals served the needs of this commercial society. Lawyers multiplied as commerce and property transactions grew more complex. The Inns of Court trained young men in law, and successful lawyers could achieve substantial wealth. Physicians and surgeons treated those who could afford their services. Clergy ranged from wealthy prelates to impoverished parish priests. Craftsmen and apprentices. The skilled trades formed the backbone of London's economy. Tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, smiths, bakers, brewers, and dozens of other craftsmen produced the goods that city life required. These trades were organized through guilds that regulated training, quality, and competition. The apprenticeship system trained the next generation of craftsmen. Boys as young as 10 or 12 were bound to masters for terms typically of 7 years. They lived in their masters' households, learned the trade, and received little or no wages. In return, masters provided food, lodging, clothing, and training. Upon completing apprenticeship, a young man became a journeyman, working for wages until he could afford to establish his own shop as a master. Life as an apprentice was hard. Masters had extensive authority over their charges, including the right to administer physical discipline. Apprentices worked long hours, had limited freedom, and faced years of service before achieving independence. Yet the system provided training and eventual opportunity for those who persevered. Servants and laborers. Domestic service employed vast numbers, particularly women. Great households might employ dozens of servants in hierarchies from steward and housekeeper down to scullery maids and stable boys. Even modest households kept servants for cooking, cleaning, and other domestic work. Common laborers performed the heavy work that kept the city functioning. Porters carried goods through the narrow streets. Watermen rowed passengers on the river. Building workers constructed and repaired the city's structures. Street cleaners, such as they were, attempted to manage the refuse. This was hard, poorly paid work, and those who performed it lived on the margins of survival. The poor and desperate. At the bottom of society were those who could not find regular work or could not work at all. Widows without support, orphaned children, the elderly, the disabled, and those simply unable to find employment made up a substantial portion of London's population. Begging was endemic on London's streets. Men, women, and children displayed their misery to passers-by, hoping for charitable coins. The monasteries and religious houses provided some relief, distributing food and alms to the poor. But charitable resources were inadequate to the need, and many suffered terribly. The fear of vagrancy obsessed Tudor authorities. Able-bodied beggars were seen as potential criminals and threats to order. Laws prescribed harsh punishments for vagrants, including whipping, branding, and even death for repeat offenders. The distinction between the deserving poor who could not work and the undeserving who would not was constantly debated and inconsistently applied. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Work, food, and domestic existence. The rhythms of the day. Life in 1500. London was governed by natural light to a degree that modern people can barely imagine. Without effective artificial lighting, the day began at sunrise and ended shortly after sunset for most activities. Candles and rushlights provided dim illumination after dark, but they were expensive and their light was feeble. The working day was long. Craftsmen typically worked from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening in winter, and from 5 to 8 in summer. These hours were enforced by guild regulations designed to prevent unfair competition through excessive work. Sunday was the only regular day of rest, enforced by both religious obligation and law. Church bells marked the hours for a population without clocks. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, structured the day for the religious, but the bells that marked them guided everyone. The curfew bell in the evening signaled the closing of the city gates and the end of legitimate activity in the streets. Meals followed patterns strange to modern habits. Breakfast was a minor meal, or non-existent for many. Dinner, the main meal, was served around midday. Supper came in the evening, typically lighter than dinner. Those who could afford it ate 2 substantial meals. The poor often made do with less. Food and drink. The diet of Londoners in 1500 varied dramatically by social class. The wealthy ate abundantly, with meat at most meals, imported delicacies, and wines from France and Spain. The middling sort ate well, but more simply. The poor survived on bread, pottage, a thick soup or stew, and whatever else they could afford. Bread was the staple food for all classes, consumed in enormous quantities. Wheat bread was preferred, but rye and barley bread were cheaper and more common among the poor. Bakers were strictly regulated, with laws controlling prices, weights, and quality. Punishment for selling underweight loaves could be severe. Meat was important for those who could afford it. Beef, mutton, and pork were most common. Poultry, game birds, and rabbit added variety. Fish was required on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and during Lent, when the church prohibited meat. The Fishmongers' Company was one of the most powerful guilds, controlling access to this essential commodity. Vegetables and fruits were seasonal, and sometimes viewed with suspicion. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were common. Cabbages, onions, and leeks appeared regularly. Fruits were eaten when available, though some medical authorities considered raw fruit dangerous. Herbs and spices added flavor and were believed to aid digestion. Drinking water was unsafe in London. The Thames and the wells within the city were contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. Consequently, everyone drank ale or beer, even children. Brewing was a major industry and a domestic activity. Stronger alcoholic drinks, including wine for the wealthy and various spirits, were also consumed. Housing and domestic life. Housing ranged from the mansions of the great to the single rooms of the poor. Noble townhouses might include dozens of rooms, extensive grounds, and accommodation for large households. Merchants and prosperous craftsmen lived above or behind their shops in houses of several stories. The poor crowded into whatever space they could afford. Privacy was virtually unknown by modern standards. Family members shared beds. Servants slept in kitchens, hallways, or wherever they could find space. Even wealthy households had limited private space, with family and servants mingling constantly. The concept of rooms dedicated to single purposes was only beginning to emerge. Furnishings were simple by modern standards. Beds were the most valuable items of furniture, often elaborately curtained for warmth and a degree of privacy. Tables, benches, and stools provided seating. Chests stored clothing and valuables. The poor might possess little more than a straw mattress and a few cooking pots. Heating came from open fires. typically on central hearths in traditional houses or in fireplaces in more modern construction. Chimneys were becoming more common, but remained a sign of relative prosperity. Smoke-filled rooms, blackening ceilings, and contributing to respiratory problems. Winter in an unheated or poorly heated room was genuinely dangerous. Health and sanitation. Sanitation in 1500, London was primitive by any standard. There was no sewage system. Human waste went into cesspits beneath buildings, into the gutters of streets, or directly into the river. Night soil men periodically emptied cesspits, carting the contents out of the city for use as fertilizer. Personal hygiene was limited. Public bathhouses had largely disappeared due to associations with prostitution and disease. Most people washed infrequently and partially. Changing undergarments was the primary method of maintaining cleanliness. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were universal companions. Disease was omnipresent. The plague returned periodically in devastating epidemics. The sweating sickness, a mysterious disease unique to this period, killed with terrifying speed. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery were constant threats. Tuberculosis claimed lives slowly but relentlessly. Venereal diseases spread without effective treatment. Medical care was limited and often counterproductive. Physicians, trained in the classical theories of humors and imbalances, prescribed treatments like bleeding, purging, and the administration of various substances that often weakened rather than helped patients. Surgeons set bones and amputated limbs without anesthesia or antisepsis. Apothecaries sold medicines of dubious value. Many relied on folk remedies, wise women, and prayer. Chapter 4: Commerce, Trade, and the Economy. The commercial heart. London in 1500 was England's commercial capital, handling the vast majority of the nation's trade and serving as the center of its financial activities. The city's location, at the lowest bridging point of the Thames with access to the sea, had made it a trading center since Roman times. By 1500, this position was unassailable. Wool was England's great export, the foundation of national wealth. English fleeces were prized throughout Europe for their quality, and the export trade was controlled through the staple at Calais. Merchants of the staple, operating under royal license, organized the sale of wool to continental buyers. The wealth generated by wool built great churches, founded colleges, and enriched merchants, who became the ancestors of noble families. Cloth was increasingly important. English weavers, including skilled immigrants from the Low Countries, produced woolen cloth that was exported throughout Europe. The merchant adventurers organized this trade, shipping unfinished cloth to Antwerp for dyeing and finishing. This trade made fortunes for London merchants, and helped shift the economy from raw material exports to manufactured goods. Imports flowed through London in return. Wine from Gascony and the Rhine was essential for wealthy tables and religious ceremonies. Spices from the East, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, added flavor to food and demonstrated status. Silk, velvet, and fine fabrics from Italy dressed the wealthy. Iron, timber, and naval stores came from the Baltic. The guilds and livery companies. The guild system organized and controlled London's trades. These ancient institutions had evolved from religious and social fraternities into powerful economic regulators. By 1500, the leading guilds had become livery companies, distinguished by the distinctive clothing their members wore on ceremonial occasions. The Great 12 livery companies dominated the city's economic and political life. The mercers, trading in fine fabrics, were the most prestigious. The grocers dealt in spices and drugs. The drapers handled woolen cloth. The fishmongers controlled the fish trade. The goldsmiths worked in precious metals and increasingly in financial services. Each company jealously guarded its privileges and fiercely protected its members' interests. Guild membership was essential for practicing a trade in London. Each guild controlled apprenticeship, ensuring that only properly trained craftsmen entered the trade. Quality standards were enforced through inspection and punishment of those who produced substandard goods. Prices were sometimes regulated to prevent undercutting. The system restricted competition, but guaranteed standards. The guilds also provided social services for their members. They maintained almshouses for aged members who could no longer work. They educated orphaned children of members. They provided funeral ceremonies and prayers for deceased members. Guild membership created a community that supported individuals throughout their lives. Markets and retail. Markets were the primary sites of retail trade. Cheapside, the broad street running through the heart of the city, was London's main market. Here, vendors sold everything from food to fabrics, from household goods to luxury items. The street was crowded and noisy, filled with the cries of vendors hawking their wares. Specialized markets served particular commodities. Smithfield, outside the walls to the northwest, was the great livestock market where cattle, sheep, and horses were bought and sold. Billingsgate was the fish market, strategically located near the river. The stocks market dealt in meat and fish. Leadenhall sold poultry, butter, cheese, and grain. Shops lined the streets of the commercial districts. Goldsmiths clustered in Cheapside, displaying their wares behind iron gratings. Booksellers and stationers gathered around St. Paul's churchyard. Drapers and mercers had their shops nearby. These were small establishments, often with the craftsman's workshop behind or above the retail space. Street vendors supplemented the fixed markets and shops. Hawkers sold everything from hot pies to old clothes. Water carriers delivered river water to households. Peddlers with packs on their backs brought goods to those who could not visit the markets. The streets rang with the distinctive cries of different vendors, each with their particular call. Money and credit. The economy operated on a combination of coin, credit, and barter. English currency consisted of pounds, shillings, and pence, but actual coins were often in short supply. Gold nobles and angels were the largest coins, used for major transactions. Silver groats and smaller coins served for everyday purchases. The smallest coin, the farthing, was literally a quarter of a penny. Credit was essential for commerce. Merchants traded on credit, keeping accounts, and settling periodically. Bills of exchange allowed money to be transferred between cities without physically moving coins. Italian bankers provided financial services that English institutions had not yet developed. Trust and reputation were crucial in a system that relied heavily on personal relationships. Foreign currency circulated alongside English coins. Venetian ducats, Florentine florins, and other coins were recognized and accepted in international trade. Money changers, often doubling as goldsmiths, exchanged currencies and assessed the value of worn or debased coins. Chapter 5: Government, Law, and Order. Royal Government. England in 1500 was a monarchy, and all authority theoretically derived from the king. Henry VII had won his crown at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending the Wars of the Roses and establishing the Tudor dynasty. By 1500, he had consolidated his power, though the memory of civil war and dynastic conflict remained fresh. The king ruled with the advice of his council, a body of nobles, bishops, and officials who helped administer the realm. Parliament, consisting of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, met only when the king summoned it, typically to grant taxes for war or other extraordinary expenses. The king's court, wherever he resided, was the center of power, and access to the monarch was the key to influence. Westminster was the administrative center of royal government. The Exchequer collected and accounted for royal revenues. The Chancery issued royal documents and writs. The law courts, King's Bench, Common Pleas, and Exchequer sat in Westminster Hall. The elaborate machinery of medieval government continued to function, though the Tudors were developing new administrative methods. London's relationship with the crown was complex. The city valued its ancient liberties, granted by royal charters over centuries. These privileges included the right to govern itself, to regulate trade, and to collect certain revenues. Kings valued London's wealth, and periodically demanded loans that were sometimes repaid and sometimes not. The relationship was one of mutual dependence and occasional tension. City government. The City of London governed itself through institutions that had evolved over centuries. The Lord Mayor, elected annually from among the aldermen, was the chief magistrate and representative of the city. The Court of Aldermen, consisting of one alderman from each of the city's 25 wards, formed the senior governing body. The Common Council, with representatives from each ward, provided broader participation. The aldermen were typically wealthy merchants from the great livery companies. They served for life once elected and wielded considerable power. They sat as justices, enforcing law within the city. They regulated trade, setting standards for weights, measures, and quality. They managed city properties and revenues. City government extended to aspects of life that might seem surprising. Regulations controlled when and where businesses could operate. Strangers, non-citizens, faced restrictions on trade and residence. Building practices were regulated, at least in theory. Moral behavior, including sexual conduct and religious observance, was subject to city authority. The wards organized city life at the local level. Each ward had its own administrative structure, including constables who kept order, beadles who carried out various duties, and the aldermen who presided. Ward meetings addressed local concerns and selected representatives to the Common Council. Law and crime. The legal system combined royal and local jurisdictions in complex ways. Serious crimes, felonies including murder, robbery, and burglary, were tried by royal courts. Lesser offenses fell under city jurisdiction. The boundaries were not always clear, and jurisdictional disputes were common. Punishment was harsh by modern standards. Death was the penalty for a wide range of offenses, from murder to theft above a certain value. Execution was public, intended to deter others from crime. Hanging was the most common method, though burning was used for heresy and treason, and boiling alive was the penalty for poisoners. Lesser punishments included whipping, time in the pillory or stocks, branding, and mutilation. The pillory was a common sight, with offenders displayed for public humiliation and sometimes pelted with refuse by crowds. Imprisonment was typically a holding measure before trial rather than a punishment in itself. Crime was rampant, and the forces of order were limited. There was no police force. Constables and watchmen were citizens serving in rotation or hired substitutes, often poorly equipped and easily evaded. The hue and cry obligated citizens to pursue criminals, but this was an imperfect system. Many crimes went unpunished. The Church and authority. The Church was deeply intertwined with government and law. Ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over moral offenses, including adultery, defamation, and breach of promise to marry. They also handled matters of marriage, inheritance of personal property, and disputes involving clergy. Clergy enjoyed benefit of clergy, which allowed them to be tried in church courts rather than secular ones. This privilege had extended to anyone who could read, since literacy was considered proof of clerical status. Church courts could not impose death sentences, so benefit of clergy often meant the difference between life and death. The Church also provided services that modern states would consider governmental. It recorded births, marriages, and deaths. It educated the young in church schools. It provided relief to the poor through monasteries and parish charity. The boundary between religious and secular authority was blurred in ways that would seem strange to modern observers. Chapter 6: Religion, Culture, and Entertainment. The Catholic Faith. England in 1500 was a Catholic country, part of the Universal Church, headed by the Pope in Rome. The Protestant Reformation that would transform English religion was still decades in the future. The Church pervaded every aspect of life, from birth to death and beyond, shaping how people understood the world and their place in it. Religious observance structured the year. The liturgical calendar alternated between feasts and fasts, celebrations and penances. Christmas, Easter, and dozens of saints' days marked the passage of time. Lenten fasting was strictly enforced. Sunday attendance at Mass was obligatory, and the church was the center of community life for most people. The church's physical presence dominated London. Over 100 parish churches served the city's neighborhoods. Religious houses of monks, nuns, and friars occupied significant properties. St. Paul's Cathedral was the mother church of the diocese and a center of city life. Crosses, shrines, and religious images were everywhere. Religious practice centered on the Mass, the miraculous reenactment of Christ's sacrifice at every altar. Confession to a priest was required at least annually. The sacraments marked life's transitions: baptism at birth, confirmation in youth, marriage for most adults, and last rites at death. Prayers for the dead, including masses and the system of purgatory, connected the living with deceased loved ones. Churches and religious houses. The parish church was the center of community life. Here, parishioners gathered for weekly mass, for baptisms, marriages, and funerals, for festivals and celebrations. The church building served multiple purposes: worship space, community meeting place, and sometimes shelter in emergencies. Parish guilds organized social activities and mutual support. The monasteries and religious houses were significant landowners and employers. London contained houses of various orders: Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and others. These communities prayed, performed works of charity, and managed their often extensive properties. They would be dissolved by Henry VIII in the 1530s, but in 1500 they remained vital institutions. Charity was a religious obligation, and the church was the primary vehicle for its distribution. Monasteries fed the hungry at their gates. Parish relief supported local poor. Guilds maintained almshouses. Wealthy individuals left bequests for prayers and charity. The system was inadequate to need, but it represented a genuine attempt to live Christian principles. Pilgrimages drew the faithful to sacred sites. Canterbury, with the shrine of Thomas Becket, was the greatest English pilgrimage destination. Local shrines attracted visitors seeking healing, blessing, or fulfillment of vows. The journey itself was considered spiritually beneficial, a break from ordinary life dedicated to holy purposes. Education and learning. Education was largely the province of the church. Grammar schools, often attached to cathedrals or major churches, taught Latin to boys who might pursue careers in the church, law, or administration. St. Paul's School, refounded by John Colet in 1509, would become one of England's leading schools. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge trained the clergy and professionals. A university education required years of study in Latin, beginning with grammar and rhetoric and progressing through logic, philosophy, and eventually specialized subjects like theology, law, or medicine. Only a small minority of the population had any formal education. Literacy was limited but expanding. Most people could neither read nor write. The wealthy, the clergy, and those in commerce and administration were most likely to be literate. The introduction of printing to England by William Caxton in 1476 was beginning to transform the availability of books, but manuscript remained important. Books were still relatively rare and expensive. Religious works dominated: Bibles, prayer books, saints' lives, and devotional texts. Practical works on law, medicine, and other subjects served professional needs. Literature, including the works of Chaucer and the romances beloved by popular audiences, circulated among those with access. Entertainment and leisure. Despite the church's suspicion of frivolity, Londoners found time for entertainment. The great festivals of the Christian year provided opportunities for celebration. Christmas was a season of feasting and revelry, lasting 12 days. May Day brought dancing, games, and general merriment. Midsummer Eve was celebrated with bonfires and festivities. Drama was beginning to evolve from religious to secular forms. Mystery plays, depicting biblical stories, were performed by guilds on major feast days. Morality plays taught religious lessons through allegorical characters. Interludes, shorter entertainments, were performed in great halls. The professional theater that would produce Shakespeare lay in the future, but its roots were developing. Blood sports were popular across social classes. Bear baiting and bull baiting drew crowds to arenas in Southwark and elsewhere. Dogs were set against bears, or bulls chained to stakes, and the resulting combat was considered great entertainment. Cockfighting attracted gamblers who bet on the outcomes. Taverns and alehouses provided gathering places for sociability and drinking. These establishments ranged from respectable inns serving travelers to disreputable dens frequented by criminals. Drunkenness was common, and authorities periodically attempted to regulate drinking houses, with limited success. Music and art. Music filled London's soundscape. Church choirs sang the daily offices and elaborate polyphonic masses. Secular music accompanied dancing, feasting, and celebration. Musicians performed in households of the wealthy, in taverns, and in the streets. Instruments included lutes, harps, recorders, and various stringed and wind instruments. Art served primarily religious purposes. Churches were decorated with paintings, sculptures, and stained glass depicting biblical scenes and saints. Religious imagery educated the illiterate and inspired devotion. Secular art was less common, though wealthy households might possess portraits, tapestries, and decorative objects. Craftsmanship of high quality was valued. Goldsmiths created elaborate religious objects and luxury goods for the wealthy. Embroiderers produced fine vestments and hangings. Woodcarvers created furniture and decorative objects. These craftsmen were artists, though the distinction between art and craft was not yet clearly drawn. The Renaissance was beginning to influence English culture. Italian ideas about art, architecture, and learning were reaching England, though more slowly than they had spread on the continent. The court of Henry VII showed some Renaissance influences, and these would accelerate under his son Henry VIII. But in 1500, England remained in many ways a medieval kingdom, not yet transformed by their cultural revolution transforming Italy. Conclusion. London in 1500 was a city poised between two worlds, the medieval structures, institutions, and beliefs that had shaped English life for centuries remained dominant. The walls still stood, the guilds still controlled trade, the church still shaped every aspect of existence, yet change was stirring. The printing press, introduced just 24 years earlier, was beginning to transform the circulation of ideas. The Renaissance, already transforming Italy, was sending its influences northward. The Tudor dynasty, barely 15 years old, would reshape English government and religion in ways unimaginable in 1500. 50,000 souls made their lives in this crowded, smelly, dangerous, vibrant city. The wealthy enjoyed comforts that would have astonished their grandparents: glass windows, chimneys, printed books. The poor endured conditions that would eventually shock later generations into reform. The middle ranks struggled to maintain their positions in a hierarchical society. The Catholic faith, which had shaped English life for 1,000 years, was about to face its greatest challenge. Within 40 years, the monasteries would be dissolved, the Pope rejected, and England would be Protestant. These convulsions, unimaginable in 1500, would transform London's physical fabric as well as its spiritual life. The city that Shakespeare would know a century later was already forming. The commercial energy, the mixture of classes and occupations, the combination of squalor and aspiration that would characterize Elizabethan London were all present in embryo. The London of 1500 was the seedbed from which Tudor greatness would grow. The Thames still flows, though London Bridge no longer carries buildings. St. Paul's still dominates Ludgate Hill, though Christopher Wren's dome replaced the medieval spire. The city still governs itself through its ancient institutions, though aldermen now preside over a financial center rather than a guild economy. The London of 1500 is gone, yet it created the city that exists today.